Okay, everyone, this is part 2 of the Chapter 11 online video lecture. We're picking up where we left off at the end of part 1. So up to this point, we had talked about competition for resources at high population densities, how that can suppress individual growth, but it can also reduce survival. So as the density of monarch butterfly eggs, for example, on a plant increases, the probability of survival decreases. And that's exactly what you see in this figure. So different studies have looked at this. Here you see on the x-axis density of eggs, so from low to high, and you see survival probability of those eggs or larvae as they hatch out of those eggs. Definitely goes down as density increases. And this is seen in lots of other examples, lots of other species as well. So it isn't just that growth rates are negatively affected by high densities, actual survival can be negatively affected as well. So the relationship between density-dependent mortality, resource availability, and growth rate is apparent for organisms that have indeterminate growth rates, including plants and some animals. So what does indeterminate growth rate imply? Species that have indeterminate growth are those that grow throughout their entire lifetimes. They don't actually stop growing, once they reach sexual maturity, for example, like most mammals do, let's say. So in species that grow all their lives, it's much easier to detect this relationship between density-dependent or density-dependent effects on growth rates. Species that have determinate growth, like humans, for example, where they stop growing, usually around age 18, 17, something like that, it'd be harder to detect beyond that point how competition for limited resources might affect that aspect of their biology because they're done growing at that point. But we can certainly see this, the effect of density-dependent resource availability on growth rate in species that show indeterminate growth. Okay, as an example, experiments with a plant called horseweed showed this very clearly. Seeds were planted at a density of about 100,000 seeds per square meter. That's pretty dense. And as the seedlings grew, there was competition among the plants for limited resources. Many seedlings died, as you'd expect, and reduced the density to about, by the end of the experiment, about 1,000 individuals per square meter. So in this case, by the end of the experiment, you have a population that's much less densely packed than it was at the beginning, and so you might expect that the individuals that survived to that point would have greater access to resources. So what would you expect to happen to the size of those remaining seedlings by the end of that experiment? Well, they found the remaining seedlings increase in size because per capita resource availability had gone up by the death of 99% of the seedlings. So in plants in particular, and also in some sessile organisms, sessile animals, that is animals that stay put in one place their entire lives, like barnacles and mussels, there's a phenomenon known as self-thinning. And so we'll just write that down. Self-thinning. This is certainly evident in plants in a lot of cases. This is caused by the combined effect of density-dependent mortality and growth in a given population. So density progressively declines and the growth of the remaining individuals increases. But again, the reason why density is declining is because of resource competition. And this is widely seen in plant populations and even in some sessile animal populations like barnacles, mussels, things like that. So here we see a couple of graphs for some plants. Let's see, in the top one, I believe this is, I think it's both the same species actually. So in panel A in the top, you're looking at changes in the number of surviving individuals and average plant size through time for an experimental population of horseweed. So what you see is that over time, right, going from beginning of the experiment toward the end, so about a 6-month period there, we see that weight of individuals definitely goes up, but also our density certainly goes down, right? So we have density of surviving plants here on the y-axis. On the secondary y-axis, we have the average weight per plant. So this axis then is pertaining to the blue line. This y-axis is pertaining to the green line. All right. Now, another way to sort of look at this, In panel B below, the data is sort of replotted to show the relationship between population density and average plant weight. So competition results in mortality, which then increases the per capita availability of resources, resulting in increased growth for the survivors. So we start off here at very high density at the beginning of the experiment on the x-axis, and our density goes down over time. We talked about that. But then look what happens as time moves forward. Look what happens to average plant weight. It goes up. So you're sort of tracking this line backwards. That's actually moving forward in time, but the reason why it appears to be going backwards on the x-axis is because the x-axis is density, and density of the population is going down over time. That's really just a different way to plot the same data that you have up here, essentially. Okay, and we see an example of that also in animals. So this is a population, I believe, of what's called black mussel. You see the same basic pattern. So at very high densities, we have very low individual body mass, but as density goes down, we see that body mass goes up. Okay, same basic pattern we saw in previous figures. Okay, so competition within a population can reduce fecundity as well. Fecundity, again, has to do with female number of offspring that females produce over their lifetime, and the effect varies quite a bit amongst different species. We're going to look at harp seals here in a moment. Basically, there was a study that looked at harp seal fecundity as it relates to competition, density, that sort of thing, population density, and it found essentially that female harp seals, I'm sorry, we'll get to the results in a minute. An important point about female harp seals is that they reach the age of maturity when they reach 87% of their mature body weight. So a female harp seal then becomes sexually mature when her body weight reaches 87% of her maximum body weight, the average maximum body weight in the population. So when population density is higher, females show reduced weight gain. And because they show reduced weight gain, that increases the mean age of sexual maturity because they have to reach that 87% threshold. It means, in other words, that females are older when they give birth to a pup. So they're waiting longer to reproduce, and we talked about that sort of thing in Chapter 10. Fertility, then, in this species is density dependent. Bird populations very often show similar patterns. So let's look at some graphs for the harp seals. So here we have in panel A, population density, and again, note that's times 10 to the 6th, though these are some large numbers, right? And here we have mean age of first reproduction. So you can see that as population density goes up, there's a positive correlation with mean age of first reproduction. I can get my pointer to work, there we go. And so at higher densities, you have females waiting longer to reproduce. At lower densities, they're reproducing sooner. All right, in panel B, here we have, this is kind of a weird measure of population density, but the population 2 years and older from the previous year. This is just a way of looking at population density. So again, low density, high density. And here we have mature females, number of mature females giving birth, or percent rather. We see that more or a larger percent of mature females giving birth at low population densities. As population density goes up, we see a dramatic decline in the proportion of individual females that are giving birth. Okay. Density-dependent control of fecundity is common in plant populations. In soybeans, for example, individual seed production is greatly reduced at higher densities. Certainly that's important to know from an agricultural and food production standpoint. In glasswort, an annual herb, the number of seeds produced per plant declines with increasing density. And that's what you see here. So the top panel is the soybean, the bottom is glasswort. So let's look at soybean first. Here you have population in terms of plants per square meter, so population density. And here we have the yield per plant, so seed yield per plant in grams. And we see definitely a marked decline with increasing population density. Then, at the bottom we have glasswort. Now, in glasswort we have, again, a decline in number of seeds per plant with population density, but it's a different pattern, right? So, again, the same thing is true. Essentially, you have a decline in fecundity or seed production in the case of plants with increasing population density. All right. So let's shift gears now a little bit and get away from talking about mortality rates, growth rates, that sort of thing, and let's look at the effect of density on dispersal. So dispersal meaning individuals that migrate out of a population into a new area. So some animals definitely do disperse. They leave their natal population, the population they were born into, to find a new habitat. So the question is, why would animals be more likely to disperse under conditions of high population density? And do they actually disperse more under high population density conditions? Which individuals would be more likely to disperse in these cases? And can dispersal actually regulate the density of a population? Is it an important regulator of population size, in other words? So these are important questions we'll look at. Dispersal happens in most populations. Some individuals leave whether density is high or low. So dispersal is typically a normal thing. Now, if population density is high, a lack of resources can develop that will force some individuals to disperse, to leave for greener pastures, let's say. These are usually subadults that are driven out by adult aggression. You can think of, subadult male lions, for example, being driven out by the alpha male, the head of the pride, because they're potentially a threat to him and his access to females. So those subadult males will typically be sort of kicked out of the population. That's typical. That's common, right? What happens to the individuals that disperse? Well, a lot of times they'll die, but some will find suitable habitat and establish a new population elsewhere. Dispersal under conditions of high density is a response to overpopulation, but it does not effectively regulate population density. Dispersal would actually be more effective at doing that when density is low or increasing before resources would become very limited. But dispersal, once high density is reached, is not really an effective mechanism of population regulation. It's not thought to be anyway. There was a study of dispersal in red squirrel population in the Yukon in Canada, and researchers found that every year a portion of older reproductive females left their home area. This dispersal actually took place in the summer when there is plenty of food typically available. You might ask, well, how does that strategy help the population, or does it help the population? Well, these authors suggested from their results that dispersal of these females helped their young offspring that remained on the home area during the winter when food was scarce. In other words, if the females waited till summer to disperse, there would typically be more food available in new habitats and that sort of thing, and the young would be better prepared and more developed at that time, having spent the previous winter in their natal habitat. In other words, more food was available for the young to eat during the winter. Okay. Some dispersing individuals can actually increase their probability of surviving and reproducing only if they disperse from the area where they were born. This is often true for juveniles. So if intraspecific competition in the home area is strong, dispersal allows juveniles to move to a habitat where competition is less intense for resources like food and breeding sites. And that would also, by the way, happen to reduce the likelihood of inbreeding. So again, we get back to this question, does dispersal regulate population density? Well, it turns out that dispersal is often positively correlated with population density, meaning that in terms of raw numbers of individuals, the number of individuals that are dispersing generally goes up as population density goes up, but there's no general relationship known to exist between the proportion of the population leaving and an increase or decrease in density. So the idea is that while the absolute numbers of individuals who disperse might go up as a result of density or increases in density, the proportion of the population that disperses does not. So in low densities, you might have, 0.1%, let's say, or 1% maybe of the population that disperses, but also at high density, you might have 1% of the population dispersing. Now the proportions there are the same, but 1% of a small population is fewer individuals than 1% of a large population. So absolute numbers, in terms of absolute numbers, yes, there's a correlation, but in terms of proportion, there's not. So dispersal is not thought to be a regulatory mechanism because of that, okay? it contributes strongly to population expansion. In other words, a species' ability to set up new populations elsewhere. And it certainly aids in the persistence of local populations. You may have a population existing as a metapopulation, as we talked about, a small population that might not be viable in its own right because it is so small, could be kept going by dispersal from a larger population nearby. So that can be an important aspect of metapopulation, long-term persistence. Okay, in this next section in the chapter, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about plants specifically, because plants are not mobile, right? I mean, when's the last time you were chased down the street by a plant? Plants are not mobile. They pretty much stay in one place for the most part, and as a result, they're able to capture and hold space for the duration of their lives. That's a little bit different than in animals, obviously. So as a result of their longevity, some plants, trees in particular, can occupy space for a really long time. How do plants exclude other individuals from their space? Well, a plant occupies a certain amount of space, excluding other individuals of the same and different species. Okay, so plants can, for example, physically cover ground. So if a plant is already in a particular spot, another plant may not be able to get there. Physically cover ground with leaves, let's say, right? Shading that ground. Plants can, of course, shade other plants and thereby limit the extent to which neighboring plants can incur on a plant's space. Plants can obviously deplete soil resources to the extent that it makes it more difficult for neighboring plants to sort of horn in on their territory. Okay, so you can sort of think of these aspects of plant behavior, if you want to call it that, as analogous to territoriality in animals. Okay, so another way to define a territory: organisms are spaced out more than expected if they were randomly occupying a suitable habitat. If they're spaced out more than you would expect, then there's some degree of territoriality going on. In animals, it can be direct behavior, direct combat, that kind of thing between males, for example. In plants, it can be, a plant physically covering ground with leaves, shading other plants, or depleting soil nutrients and minerals, soil resources. All right. So there was a study of the role of competition for below-ground resources in the spatial arrangement or distribution of trees in acacia savannas in South Africa. The authors of this study analyzed the distance between trees and their nearest neighbors, and they found that adult acacia trees are uniformly distributed, and that's a result of overlap in rooting zones and competition for those resources. So they looked at different locations also with varying amounts of soil moisture. And what they found was that the distance to nearest neighboring trees decreased with an increase in soil moisture. In other words, more soil moisture present, less competition for that soil moisture, and so plants can actually be packed in a little bit more tightly. And that's what you see here in this figure. So up at the top, you can see an acacia tree on the savanna. So up here in this first panel, we have again, you see sort of a uniform distribution of individual plants, but a lot of space between them. Here you have a more densely packed uniform distribution. And so when you look at soil moisture on the x-axis, or soil moisture index, a measure of how available water is, and here you have the average nearest neighbor distance in meters, you can see that as soil moisture increases, the nearest neighbor distance decreases up to a point. Right here it kind of flattens out. But this sort of distribution here would be what you might find in a case where there's less soil water available. Here, more densely packed would be where you have more water available, so less competition for that resource. All right, so changes in population growth are often directly correlated with variation in moisture and temperature. As an example, a number of years of dry weather can lead to, for example, outbreaks of insect pests like spruce budworm, for example, is known to behave in this way. The outbreaks tend to end when warmer and wetter weather returns. Desert animals will typically show a direct relationship between precipitation and population growth. Obviously, in a desert, water is one of the most limiting factors. Good example, Miriam's kangaroo rat can survive long dry periods. Desert mammals are well known for having a really long loop of Henle in their kidneys, which means they can very effectively pull water out of the urine and that sort of thing. And kangaroo rats are exceptionally good at this. So in this species of kangaroo rat, reproduction coincides with seasonal moisture that stimulates plant growth in the fall and winter, and the females require green, new succulent plant growth when pregnant and lactating in January and February. If rainfall is low, plants aren't going to develop, and kangaroo rats would then have low levels of reproduction, and this has been shown. Animals in areas with harsh winters can be directly affected by snow accumulation. So white-tailed deer, for example, populations in Minnesota, snow accumulation during the winter affects the average number of fawns that a female deer will have in the spring. The annual change in the population is inversely related to snow accumulation the previous winter. All right, and so here we can see that, for example. So in panel A, we have the sum of 3 previous winter snow accumulations in meters. So these took how many snow accumulations, or how much snow they got each winter for the past 3 winters, added it up, and that's what this x-axis is. And here you have the number of fawns per doe, right? So what we definitely see is that as snow accumulation increases, number of fawns per doe, or the fawn to doe ratio, goes down. Here we have sum of 3 previous winter snow accumulations again, and now we have the annual change in deer population. That goes down as well, as you would expect, being driven by lower birth rates in this figure. All right, so obviously they're having less access to food, to browsing on, grasses and things like that. All right, so the last part of this chapter we're going to save for part 3. I forgot to time this. I'm afraid I might be at about a half hour, so I'm going to go ahead and stop and on part 2 here, and then we'll pick up with these aspects of population regulation regarding human activities. Okay, so back to part 3 here in just a little bit.